So hi everyone. I'm Tvetene Chowdhury. I work with the Global Poverty and Practice minor, and that's the minor that that hosts the introductory course that I know some of you are in, GPP 115. So just a quick overview of the minor. This is a chance for undergraduate students from any discipline to explore issues of poverty and inequality and study some of the debates around approaches to addressing these issues, both from a theoretical and a practical lens. And so students take courses that help prepare them with a certain analytical framework to understand several of these issues. And then alongside that, students engage in what we call a practice experience, where they work with an organization, either domestically or internationally, to better understand that organization's approach to addressing some aspect of poverty or inequality, so that they can connect what they learned from that practical experience with what they're learning in their classrooms. And we provide a lot of resources and support to students to go through that experience, and the coursework really ties nicely into that to help students think through beyond their time in Cal, how they see themselves engaging with poverty action down the line in their personal lives, their professional lives, through their political participation, and so on. So if any of you are interested in learning more, you can feel free to reach out to us. I'll put our minor's email address in the chat. Yeah, so with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tvetene, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited today. It's our last GPP live session, and it was a great opportunity to have this collaboration. So being here is peculiar expression for the present circumstances that we are sharing. There is no here in a Zoom gathering. There are many here as we are in attendance. Well, maybe less than the usual many, but rather than assuming an undefined abstract virtual here, our different here locations compelled Tvetene and myself to acknowledge all the more strongly that the here has a name and a history. So my name is Yael Perez. I have a PhD in architecture, and I'm speaking from Berkeley, situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Ohlone people. And I'm virtually joined by Tvetene Carlson, who is a PhD student in civil and environmental engineering. And though Tvetene is currently not located in Berkeley, he'll do the land acknowledgement for Berkeley, as this institutional affiliation brought us to this ritual here. So I'll move it to you, Tvetene.
Thank you, Yael. Just to begin, as most of us are connected to the UC Berkeley system, we should identify and acknowledge that the UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay community today. And
thanks, Tvetene. And after acknowledging the land, we would like to acknowledge our positionality and why do we need to position ourselves and do it out loud. And I'm sorry, I have my notes in front of me and I cannot monitor the chat as I'm sharing the screen, but Tvetene can look. But we'll take question at the end, and we'll try to put some links as we speak. So we learned the practice of positionality from disciplines that have been doing field work and have been learning from some of their own ethical mistakes, like geography and anthropology. And field work is always contextual, relational, embodied, and politicized. So as we bring this to engineering and to the sciences, who used to consider research as objective, our work becomes more ethical through the awareness of our position in the world, our privileges, our perspectives, as a way of us and as a way for us and for our audience, you, to be aware of any potential biases. If you will continue to GPP 105, you will learn more about some of the practices and practicalities of doing field work, field research, which will serve those heading to a practice experience, as Tvetene described. So Tvetene will start with his positionality, and then I'll follow with mine before we start presenting our actual work.
So to start with my positionality is, I'll just give the my summary sentence of my demographics of I'm a mixed Athabascan and Scandinavian man with a college education and I'm from the native village of Cantwell, where I'm currently talking to you all from. The pictures presented to you right now are from the hunting grounds and me and my sister on those hunting grounds just outside of Cantwell. And I share these pictures with you both because I think they're beautiful and also because they represent the land of which I walk on and is critical to my identity as a Native person. It's where I grew up walking and hunting and surrounded by family that knows the land better than I do, even though I do consider it better myself, knowing it better than the back of my own hand. But more than the land is only one part of my identity. The other part is my education. I'm college educated, which does have a dramatic effect on the way others view me and the way I view myself. And I mentioned this college education for that reason, and also because it was at my undergraduate institution that I became involved in this organization called the Alaska Native Science and Engineering Program. And my Native identity before becoming attached to that program was very much connected to my family, to my community. But it was at this organization where I became connected to a greater Native community on the size of my state, and through that organization, through the rest of the nation. And gaining that connection and all this support to letting me pursue my undergraduate in civil engineering and into my doctorate now it's given me a drive and a purpose, and a reason why I care about Native issues is to pay back that support that I've received from these communities. And that's about the extent of my current position.
Thanks. So while I'll talk mostly today about my PhD work, I'm actually currently a researcher at the Blum Center for Developing Economy, as well as the Infuse Program Coordinator at UC Berkeley, which stands for Innovation at the Nexus of Food, Energy, Water System, which is NSF-funded research traineeship. The Blum Center is a multidisciplinary research unit on campus focused on education, research, and leadership for equitable society. My professional background, as I mentioned, includes a PhD in architecture, but no expertise in Indigenous scholarship. Moreover, as you may hear in my accent and maybe see, I'm neither American nor native to any land, actually. In fact, if I trace back my family roots, looking at least 3 generations above me and looking down at my kids, each of us were unrooted and rerouted, some by choice and some by necessity, and each started a life in a new country, with a new language, with a new culture, at least once in a lifetime, often 2 or more. I was born in Belgium, grew up in Israel, and I'm living now in California. I'm sharing this with you because I believe this is what drew me to work with the Pinot-Laville Pomo Nation. In particular, I remember walking with the chairperson of the Pinoleville Common Nation, and you see that picture from that walk, Leona Williams, and hearing her expressing the deep feeling she had for this land on which her ancestors had been walking for many generations back. Hearing her helped me reflect on myself and my relationship to my past and my own positionality working with Indigenous communities. I believe each of us, one way or another, holds such longing to a land. So I might say that envy drew me to this collaboration, and I have been fortunate to have been exposed to that knowledge, which is based on deep relationship with the land, culture, and nature. But I'm surely not the only active person in the collaboration, and as Tvetene and I will present our respective work with different Indigenous communities, I'd like you to keep this knowledge in the back of your mind and think with us, why do we do this? Coming from these positions we described, and what societal role are we playing or serving in addition to our roles in the project that we will describe here today. And I'll move on, and I think this is for you, Tvetene, to start with.
Thank you. So to start with, what are some of the pros and cons of being an outsider versus an insider? Well, to begin with, one of the most obvious answers to the pros of being an insider is embodied knowledge. Growing up in a community, you know the right people to contact, you know the places to go to, and you just have a feel for what's right, what's wrong, what will make people nervous if you come in with a project idea, what's free for you to talk about and what might be taboo. And on the most basic levels, just logistics as well. Like you might know, oh yeah, I can easily drive into this community versus might need to fly and that might take a month for me to plan. And you just have a better idea of the groundwork. A second thing, and this is straddled as being a pro and a con, is being regarded as an outsider. Can be seen, you can come in as a college educated individual or just any given expert into a community can make you be viewed as an expert, which can be valuable because that community will hopefully get to ask you many questions and you can teach them, can answer those questions, and they will find value in that knowledge that you're providing to them. But it can be dangerous if your position as an expert is used, particularly in a specific situation that I have in mind, is if there are a political dispute in the community that you're going into, and they may try to use your opinion as your expert opinion as evidence to trump over one faction or another in this political dispute, which is something that you may not want to be involved with or support. And then this third bulletin, and one that I particularly want to emphasize, is that what you may view as being an outsider versus an insider is not always a constant. Many people will disagree on what's the line between the two. I'm coming at this from being between worlds, as was in one of the earlier slides, and being both mixed race, coming from for Alaska, a very unique village, as most Alaska villages are off the road system, whereas mine is on the road system. So I'm able to drive here from an airport, versus most of the others would have to fly into their community. Most other people would have to fly into their communities, which dramatically changes what life is like in these communities. And just to pull a story from a mentor of mine from my undergraduate institution, Professor Yachmanef. She is a Unangan woman from the Aleutian Islands. And during her work as an environmental engineer, she worked in a Yupik community. Now, the Yupik community is related linguistically to Unangan, but in some of her work there in the Yupik communities, she was still regarded as a white-sider. She was called a Gusik along with the other white engineers and who came to the community with her because she didn't speak the language. And I mentioned all this because there are groups within groups, and with natives in particular, native is encompassing a lot of peoples. There's a reason we use pluralization of people. And my family, my community is very different from the Cherokee in Oklahoma. We're very different from the Diné of Arizona. And that's important to remember that distinction when working with community. And even if you may consider yourself an insider, there may be some in the community that will still consider you an outsider.
Sorry, I didn't mean to move on quite yet. So the aspect I'd like to share some of my experiences, and Tvetene and I are trying to put ourselves in different positions, but as Tvetene mentioned, there's a lot of gray areas of being insider versus outsider. But I didn't come with any knowledge about Indigenous culture. In fact, I'm almost embarrassed to say how little I knew about Native Americans. And at the beginning, I thought myself as weak when I described my work on campus and my work with Indigenous people. But as things developed, I learned that my weakness and ignorance gave me the advantage of being a tabula rasa, a clean slate with no biases, no identity that can be connected, or identity that can be connected to one side or another. So no knowledge that I should have known or information I shouldn't have heard. So it may seem bizarre, but I realized that through other projects that I got involved with. An example with the Palestinian communities, where despite living in the US or despite any political views I may hold, I would still be considered to Palestinian communities as an Israeli, and I cannot really or willingly deny this part of my identity, which made collaboration a challenge, to say the very least, in the Middle Eastern context. So I learned to consider my ignorance and advantage, and to learn from scratch, basically, from the community I'm working with. As a professional, as an architect in my case, what works really well was that I was a student and I worked with students. And as students, we would learn together, learn with the community. And as part of the learning, we would bring a lot of options to solution, rather than quickly develop the one solution. So this requires time, and we will list at the end some of the recommendation we have to working with community, and patience is definitely there. But I was always part of the institution, and now being paid by the institution, I'm even more part of the academic institution. And I'd like you to reflect whether this part of our joint identity here, we're all affiliated to the institution one way or another, I think, whether this affiliation, being part of this big institution, put us as planner according to Easterly in the Weitzman burden. And as we think of the role of academic institution, feel free to put some thoughts in the chat, and I'll move it back to Tvetene to describe some of the research methods we use. And move the slide.
Thank you, Yael. So just to start with a caveat, the experiences that I'm pulling from, I did not do direct anthropological research with them. I was either a student researcher or an engineering intern with the communities I interacted with. But I did work with people who did perform those interviews, community meetings, and I am pulling from multiple sources, particularly the Hunters and Bureaucrats, which is that book in the top right there, which I heavily recommend if you are interested at all at looking at how two different epistemologies between a Native group, particularly an Athabascan group, and Euro-Americans can clash, particularly in when it comes to writing policy. But to begin with, for academic research methods and incorporating positionality into that and just working with community, the first and one of the best ways to do it is just talk to the community, perform interviews, which can be as casual as just finding someone in the community, cold emailing them, just asking them a couple of questions related to the community, or it can be very involved, very in-depth. You can have a recorder, give them a heads up with a subject line and a couple important points that you hope to discuss with them so that they can prepare their own knowledge through their own means before you come in with your specific questions that are hopefully not leading questions. And I'm bringing all this from working in Greenland with some researchers who were focused on learning from the community about what their housing needs were, because houses were imported from Denmark that may have met Danish needs but did not meet Greenlandic needs, and understanding the unique economy of Greenland, because hunting is a major factor there, unlike in Denmark, Europe, and America. And another method of academic research that I heavily recommend is just living in the community. That Greenland research trip, I lived there for 2 months performing my research. Now, I did not speak the language. It was not the best anthropological setting for me to be in, but it's still an excellent way, particularly if you do speak the language and if you do have those insider traits to get to know people. You get to run into them just walking around, and you can learn from them, particularly if you're looking to help improve the community. You can learn where their priorities are. You can go out hunting with them if you're in my community and see how important and valuable that is and how much life focuses around that activity. Similarly, if you were to go to an agricultural community and see there's a huge emphasis on going to, let's say, a river for prayer or some similar activity. And this specific example here for the author of this Hunters and Bureaucrats book, he spent 4 or 5 years living in Burwash Landing in the Yukon Territory of Canada to write that book, to learn from the community there and all the various opinions that and cultures that live within that community. On to you, Yael.
And my research sits in the field of design theories and method. As such, I have been investigating the design process and not indigenous culture or indigenous people. My research subject were the designers. In the first case study, the subjects were me and the KERS design team and the community we worked with. We were each subjects in the research as well as the researcher. And we went through a process of reflection on action, a methodology from the design profession that is now common in other disciplines, developed into process tracing by some and reflexivity in other cases. Each of these methodologies are different, but all aiming to analyze the process we were going through. Later, and I'll show a bit on that too, I organized an international design competition, which served as a research platform for a design experiment with the designers who participated as my research subject. So I had a competition that any designer could sign up for, and I got access to the process that all these designers were going through, all working on the same project at the same time, but with different tools. So it's almost a lab experiment, but in a real life context, since design competitions are a common practice in architecture. And both Tvetene and I will show a bit more about our research, but I couldn't help myself and avoid speaking about SEN as it brings us to consider mixed method, which is becoming more the common practice in academic research and specifically in community-based work. It wasn't the case when I started the PhD. It wasn't that much of a common practice to use mixed method. You were, in our first research method class, we were divided into the quantitative and the qualitative people. But now most people, or many people would use, many researchers would use a mixed method. And in the GPP class, you have read, in this class, you have read several theories to better understand global poverty and development as political concept. In this session of GPP Live, we brought the practice of development, or at least we try to bring some examples of practicing development. And to connect the two, I find Amartya Sen perspective in development as freedom very useful. And I'll read one of the quote I appreciate the most. The ends and the means of development call for placing the perspective of freedom at the center of the stage. The people have to be seen in this perspective as being actively involved, giving the opportunity in shaping their own destiny, and not just as passive recipient or fruits of canning development programs. So development, according to Sen, should enable people to, and I quote again, lead the kind of life they have reason to value. So if we try to bring this perspective and the concept of freedom to design and to engineering, to create what we call in Berkeley development engineering, that puts greater responsibility on the designer to understand what is the kind of life that the people, the users, the community have reason to value. And before coming up with an engineered solution. So in my work at the Blum Center now, I try to show that implementing this perspective in design and engineering leads to sense freedom. Hence, design as freedom is the process, hence design as freedom. So we can take this development as freedom into design as freedom, which put greater emphasis on the process, on the design process as an additional opportunity for impact. And the process is just as important as the design product or the design result. But sometimes the academic practice and the community practice have values that clash. And Tvetene will give some example he encountered, and I'll give some others.
Excellent mention of development engineering there. To start off with some of the clashes that are experienced when working with communities is to start off oral versus written knowledge. And as we all probably know, in interacting with the academic world, the written word is prioritized above almost all things here, which is not applicable in many communities in the world, particularly in the fashion of the way that people learn, where in academic settings, it's often seen that all knowledge is transferable or must be transferable. It should be able to be put down to like a bit size as in a computer and can be transferred in completion to someone else, versus in many Native communities where knowledge is something that is inherent to the person. It is context dependent. It cannot be directly transferred because it is only experience that is the true source of knowledge. And the way you gain experience is through practice that is informed by observing your elders, observing the experts, and hopefully being able to mimic them. And if you mess up, they can help you out a little bit in that, but in the end, you need to do the thing. You need to perform the action. You need to learn on your own. And from that, we get the second point of this clash between knowledge of epistemological conflict into how it's expressed in living on the land versus observing from a plane, which is, I'm pulling from the Hunters and Bureaucrats book again, is the situation in which biologists and native hunters who are in attempting to co-manage hunting resources, caribou, sheep, and moose, will come into conflict over what's the best method for determining the amount of animals that should be killed. Because the biologist methodologies often include putting some of the, I was about to say putting some of the animals to sleep. That's not exactly what I was meaning, tranquilizing them. And tagging them with radio collars, or flying around in biplanes and counting the amount of sheep on a mountain as an example. Whereas many of the hunters and the people that live in the villages find that deeply offensive, first because both of those methods of counting the sheep disturb the sheep, like putting a collar on something that grows up and lives without a collar is disturbing to the animal. It can be seen as playing with them. And more importantly, they feel like their knowledge of these animals is being denigrated and ignored, because these biologists are just coming in here for a week or a day to perform the study and then leaving back to their homes and wherever land, versus these are the people who know what the sheep are about. They know how their lives are going because they're out there every day on the land, seeing what's happening, feeling the weather, feeling the wind. And this imbalance in priority can be a source of conflict, particularly in writing policy. On to you, Yael.
So another aspect that I encounter some clashes again and again, and technically each time we had the Pinot-Level Promenation, the PPN, coming to campus, and part of their visit to campus, they will ask to visit the Hearst Museum in the Department of Anthropology. And people at the museum would always prepare to this visit and would actually ask where exactly they are from, and would bring out some of the baskets that are coming specifically from the area where the PPN are. And they would lay them around and would offer some surgical gloves for people to be able to hold these baskets. And we talked a lot, and I wonder what do you all think of that? Or maybe I gave in a bit the picture, but what's wrong in this picture of all of us looking at baskets and being able to hold them with a pair of surgical gloves? Feel free to unmute yourself. I just feel we're talking a lot, and I'd be happy to hear more voices. So what we learned through those visits, and I'll explain a bit how we changed them, is that this was terribly painful to ask indigenous communities to hold baskets, which are their ancestral artifact, with gloves, and to have this artificial material in between, and they would come out in tears. And in other visits, we were better prepared, and the museum have put a few of the artifacts that they have that are not necessarily sensitive to touch. And you can see in the picture down on the right, some of the use in visiting the museum. And some of the artifacts there are actually behind a glass, but nearby there were artifacts that they could just touch. And there was a clapper, and there was some baskets. And the youth
immediately took the clapper and started to clap. As one student was starting to clap, other students started to do their traditional dances inside the museum. And it brought very strongly to the surface these clashes between how Western society experienced the preservation of artifacts, while, as Tvetene mentioned, the indigenous experience is embodied, and the preservation is a preservation of cultures, of culture and activities rather than artifacts. So I'll put later in the chat an article that we wrote about some of these visits. But another aspect, and I give the story of this collaboration a few times now, and each time I look up for article, and unfortunately I find new article that criticize UC Berkeley for not being, for holding these some remains, Native American remains. So I just wanted also to mention that the historic trauma and mistrust that exists specifically between the academia and indigenous people, but more specifically between UC Berkeley and indigenous people in California, and the history of abusive relationship over the years. And there was the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that was enacted in 1990, that acknowledges the right of lineal descendants, Native American tribes, and Native Hawaiian organization to the return of certain human remains and cultural items. And NAGPRA requires museums that receive federal fundings to inventory their collection, to engage in consultation, and to offer transfers of control when certain conditions apply. So these last words, as you can imagine, are the certain condition that needs to be applied are the source of continuous argument, and are part of why the PPN are looking to build the Living Culture Center in which they can hold, preserve, and put into use their own cultural artifacts. Some recent mistrust between tribes and campus are in this title that I pasted. And again, one of them is from 2008, but others are very recent from this past June. You see campus lag in returning Native American artifacts. And the remains of about 1,200 American Indian rest in drawers and cabinets in the gym's basement. Many of them were dug up by university archaeologists and have been stored under the pool since the early 1960s. And I'll put some of these articles later in the chat. And more recently, you may have seen the news on renaming some of the buildings on campus, which I find to be a very important institutional change that we will talk a bit at the end. So one of them is Kroeber Hall, which houses the Department of Anthropology and which was named after Alfred Kroeber, who founded and built the anthropology department around indigenous people in California, and is most known for the story of Ishi. And I put the book cover here, and I think there's a movie as well. And I won't get into the whole story, but I will highlight and recommend you to read the book. And I'll cite here Nancy Shepard Hughes, an anthropology professor who was writing on the Berkeley blog and when the renaming of Kroeber Hall came up. That one, and she says that about the book on Ishi, which was actually written by his wife, Kroeber's wife, and not by him. UC Press editor called the book our Bible, And in a way, it was our Bible, beginning with our state's original sin. So I'll put the link to her blog and some of the renaming articles as well in the chat. And with this in the background, Tvetene and I will present, Tvetene will start with presenting his work with indigenous tribes, and I'll then present my collaboration with the PPN.
Thank you, Yael. So to begin—
You did put in the chat, thanks.
Yeah. To begin with, the work that I've done in the past is first on the Alaska Native Tribal and Health Consortium. I was an engineering intern working in the DHE department, focusing on constructing and maintaining water and wastewater treatment systems in the Alaska Native villages all throughout the state. And in this, I had a mentor who took me all throughout the state and taught me a lot in regards to not just the treatment of the water itself and the water quality, but also the supporting infrastructure, about road construction, about power systems and controls, because there's a lot of infrastructure that is taken for granted in larger communities that is not present within some of the villages that we worked in. But my big takeaway from this project is that there was a lot of travel, a lot of flying, and a lot of staying in rather remote communities. And in those travels, I learned that one, there's always a contact person. There's always someone that before you fly out, before you begin any of the work, you call them up, you contact them, you figure out, hey, where's a good place for me to stay? Hey, what's the trouble? What are we looking at? What's good, what's bad? Who should we talk to, if not you, to get the community's permission? And what might we need? And next slide. And here's just a couple of the communities that I did get to do field work in. The above is Igiagig, looking over Lake Iliamna, the largest lake in Alaska. And I spent about a week in that community helping to implement a new water treatment system in their washateria. Washateria is basically a cafeteria for water, where there's laundry machines, bathrooms, and a pipe to collect drinking water to bring to your own house if you have the systems available. And the bottom picture is of the water source for Nelson Lagoon on the edge of the Alaska Peninsula, right before the Aleutian chain starts. And that water source it's a lake that is 10 miles from the community, because the community itself sits on another peninsula on the peninsula, which was quite a four-wheeler ride to get out there. Next slide. And then my other work that I'm pulling from is the Greenland Work that I mentioned earlier in Kanak, one of the most northern communities in the world. In this project, I was directly connected to the project studying the soil properties to hopefully, and particularly permafrost, to hopefully inform future construction practices and better design the houses that were going to be reconstructed there in the future. Again, connecting back to what I mentioned earlier about houses imported from Denmark that are good for Danes. They didn't expect permafrost to be as big of an issue as it is up in Kanak. And connecting it to what we've presented so far is a lot of the work that I saw there in particular there were multiple presentations we gave to the community members there. And I was present for both of them. I did not know what was happening because I was given in Greenlandic and Danish. But it was still clear and cut communication. But that's also where I observed some culture clashing, particularly first, there was difficulty in getting some temporary workers because we were doing our research during whaling season. And for a lot of the people there, if a family member were to call up and say, hey, we got like 3 narwhal, come over and help us, they would drop us because that takes priority over what work we hire them for, particularly being a chef. The second thing that I noted, particularly with the presentations, was technical terms. Specifically, there's a difference between like gravel, sand, silt, and clay, but those words don't exist in Greenlandic. The idea of these like separations in types of dirt didn't really exist because it didn't really matter. And that's an important thing to remember in any communication with communities, but also just in general when when translating whatever your specific technical field is, be it anthropology or STEM, social sciences, not anthropology specifically, is being aware of what ideas are present within the audience that you're trying to communicate with. But that's the two projects that I have worked on that I'm pulling my experience from. And then here's just a couple pretty pictures of Qaanaaq on the bottom with the heavy fog over the ocean. To the right is the field site where we were collecting the soil data with just a pretty little like signpost glove there next to our line that was collecting the data. And the top left photo is one of those community meetings I was talking about with, if you can look closely, you can see some meals and drinks, which I heavily recommend that for anything involved with making friends and just talking to people. Bring along food, get some meals, just a little bit of candy to share. That just makes everyone's mood a lot better and makes the environment a lot friendlier and a lot more prone to conversation.
Thanks, Tvetene. And that just to emphasize is working in any culture. So I'll start here by presenting a bit the collaboration, which actually started with a small group of students as part of a class we took with Professor Alice Agugino, and we created the CARES, which was an organization to help communities do conscious decision about sustainability. Together with the community and to find sustainable ways of living. And our work started in a workshop, let me make sure, with the Pinot Pomo Nation. So in parallel, when we created the CARES team, and there was the environmental director of the Pinot Pomo Nation looking to collaborate with students on campus and to have students help them in different projects that the environmental department of the Pinot Pomo Nation was looking to pursue, including the design and construction of culturally sensitive housing. And that was the first project we did. As part of this project, we started by a community meeting and try to understand what sustainability means. So there were already several definitions for sustainability back then in the academic world, but we wanted to hear from the community what does it mean to them, and this is the definition that they wanted to bring to the front. So this is a combination of cultural sovereignty, economic self-sufficiency, tribal sovereignty, which is political sovereignty, and environmental harmony. So not exactly the definition that were out there, and that was an important discussion to start with as we consider different design for the housing. We then went through a process of co-design, co-construction, and as we did that, we looked at what does it mean to co-design and what can help in that process. The houses were funded by HUD and EPA. They secured the funding for that, the PPN. And later it feed actually
two and a half maybe PhD dissertation and at least 3 master's dissertation on campus. But what really kept the collaboration going was the motivation of the tribe to see this project coming through. So as part of my dissertation, I looked into understanding co-design and what should go into the process. One of the things I identify in our process is that we had to start with this abstract decision that has nothing to do to form or to how it should look like. And then it was very useful to bring, as I mentioned before, a few examples of different forms and get the feedback from the community. And then we had what we call in architecture a design charrette. We had the community interact through form. So I've created these cardboard pieces where they can design the houses themselves. So at the beginning, they were saying that they want to have round houses, that being round is part of their traditional houses. And as an architect, I know this is not easy to solve and not easy to live with. But I thought that as we will work on the design together, they will realize it themselves. And as they did, and I created those pieces, some of them were round and some of them were squarish. And as they went into solving the plan for the house, they managed to do a plan that has, I don't know if you see, but the entry is 2 corners that are round and 2 other corners where there's room that were squarish, and in the center there was this round central core of the house, which was the social gathering place of the house. So it came out as a surprise to me to be able to resolve that and bringing the professional practice and the community, the cultural practices together. Then, and thanks, I saw quickly the question in the chat, so I'll describe a bit here the competition. I've secured some funding from campus just for the competition itself to give prizes for the designers who participated. And that motivated several firms to participate in a competition for a living culture center, which is in between a museum and a cultural center for the Pomo, actually more than beyond the Pinot-Level Pomo Nation. So there are several Pomo tribes in the area. And I had, I think, around 40 participants, and each of them was part of this research where they would give feedback on different technology that we use. And some of them were in the area, so they could visit. We organized these tours to the site, and some of them had to rely only on technology, and that allowed the comparison between different ways of design and evaluating what can help in the process and specifically what can help designer understand the place better. Later, as we grew into becoming part of the Blum Center for Developing Economies, there were more institutional acknowledgement to the importance of working with communities, which was not always the case on campus. We brought students to do different work depending on the project that the Pinot-Level Pomo Nation had need and wanted to collaborate on, mostly with the environmental director, but with also with the housing department, as well as the education department. And in the last years, they have been securing grants, many grants from the Department of Education for STEM STEM and academic success centers. So we were working, and we had GPP students working with the Pinot-Level-Pomo Nation on summer camps, as well as different workshops throughout the years. They were organizing a makerspace, and we had a student in graduate students who look to the meaning of makerspace with Indigenous, where making is really already part of the tradition. So what does it mean to bring new technology to something that has been traditionally done in a different way within the culture? And before I end this short description of the project, I wanted to bring the quote. I invited Jean-Paul Jones, who is the architect who designed the American Indian Museum in Washington, to be one of the jury in the design competition. We had some community representative as well as professional people, and I wanted him to be part of that committee. And the answer he told me is that it's very hard for me to believe that an international design firm would seriously understand Indigenous people of this country and not make the design overly romantic. So with that quote and a long email that he sent, he didn't agree that a design competition would allow to have adequate design solution. And that was a thought-provoking question that allowed me to write a whole dissertation. So we want to end with a few thoughts about practicalities. Let me just make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Tvetene, am I starting on this, or? Yeah. So there are several layers to the partnership, and on each side of the collaboration, we have different partners. In the past 12 years of the collaboration and the partnership itself has changed. Each of us has changed. We got married, we got divorced, we were students, we had jobs, we lost jobs, we gave birth, we had kids in school, we had kids moving on, going to college, going to rehab, coming back home. And we keep changing, and the institution is changing too. And that is the most encouraging part for me, and seeing the institution change. And all of us here are affiliated to higher education institution as students or teacher or staff or faculty. And being part of an education institution is a privilege and a responsibility. By educating you, some of your students who will become professionals, we have the power to change the future of Indigenous communities you may end up working with or within, and the future of the scientific community. And the success of these changes is built on many individual relationships established through these programs. The Pomo Youth with UC Berkeley students, but also the individual relationship of me with the vice chair of the Pinot-Level-Pomo Nation. These relationships give meaning to the work, but our power as individual comes through using this joint work as a tool to shape the different institutions we are part of. And these are the academic or tribal government, EPA, or other stakeholders we're working with. So the list we put here together and is not complete. You can probably add to it yourself, and you will surely be able to add to it when you do your own work with communities. Tvetene has had his own experiences, but we found these to be common to both of our experiences. You want to share, Tvetene, which of these are you found the most critical?
Yeah, so there is all wonderful advice. And again, this is, as Yael said, this is not a complete list. You will find more if you pursue community-based research or just community work in general. Important points, other important factors that may not be on this list that's unique to your community. But for this one, again, I just want to emphasize the need to have a contact person, to have someone or many people in a community that you're choosing to work with, because in the end, that's what makes up a community, is it's people. And if you're hoping to work with them, you need to find some of the people you need to develop those relationships, which then goes into those other next 2 points of establish a relationship and maintain it. Communication, communication, communication. Even if you're having slow moments, if you've collected all your data and you're just writing, send a draft to your contact person. Let them know that you're still working, that you're still making progress, and even ask for some feedback from them. If it's a draft, if it's you exploring a new idea that might turn into a possible future project. It's about maintaining that relationship, because it takes a long time for these relationships, for these interactions to develop, hence why you should start early and be patient. Before that, you start really seeing the fruits of these developed relationships, of these community projects. I could just keep going on and on about all those points, but I think they can all speak for themselves, and you'll find more looking into your own resources, doing your own research. So thank you for listening, everyone. This is me and Yael's contact information if you wish to contact either of us in the future to learn more about the organizations we've been a part of, or that we could even get you in contact with.